I'm following our VBS theme the last 3 weeks on the Olympics. And so we've been talking about some medal winners from God, particularly people you probably have never heard of. And so I've been starting each week with a little Olympic trivia, 3 or 4 questions, just asking if you know some Olympic trivia. So here's the first one. You can just speak to the person next to you and give your guess. Which Olympic Games were the first to be televised? Would that have been Berlin in 1936, Rome in 1960, or Tokyo in 64? How many say Berlin? How many say Rome? How many say Tokyo? Well, guess what? Berlin was first. Adolf Hitler was eager to show off the racial and technology superiority of the Aryan race. So the stadium broadcast the Olympics to screens set up all around Berlin. The first televised back to the United States was Rome. And then in the Berlin Olympics, as I talked about at the end of the lesson last week, Jesse Owens spoiled Mr. Hitler's day and spoiled his life, really, and sort of embarrassed Hitler and his television station. Which Olympian has won the most medals? Carl Lewis, Larissa Latyna, and Michael Phelps. Yeah, that's a gimme, isn't it? Kind of a gimme. Actually, Larissa Latyna won 18 gold medals. That's pretty good. But Michael Phelps, he's got 23 gold medals, 23 medals overall, and 23 gold medals, 28 total medals. He's way ahead of the whole rest of the field. Who was the first Olympic swimmer to swim 100 meters in less than 1 minute? Was it Johnny Weissmuller in 1924, Rowdy Gaines in 1984, or Michael Phelps in 2004? Tell you what, just shout out your answer. Yeah, well, you know what the answer is? The answer is Tarzan. Johnny Weissmuller in 1924 was the first to swim 100 meters in less than a minute, and then he went on from there to his role as Tarzan. And in his role as Tarzan, he is known primarily for one thing, and here it is. I could listen to that all day. That's childhood right there, my friends. That is childhood. True story. 1958, Johnny Weissmuller and some friends went to Cuba to visit before Fidel's revolution, and he and some friends were on the way to play golf when their vehicle was attacked by bandits. And Weissmuller climbed out and gave his famous Tarzan yell, and when the banditos heard that, they stopped and said, "Welcome to Cuba, Tarzan." Then instead of robbing them, they escorted him and his friends to the golf course. It's good to be Tarzan, I guess. So we're talking about what it means to be a champion for God, and rather than talk about some obvious champions for God like Moses and Abraham and David and Peter and Paul, I've been picking and choosing with some less obvious ones, probably names you have never heard before. So a couple of weeks ago, we talked about Benaiah, the strong warrior, mighty warrior for God who became David's chief security officer, who chased a lion into a pit on a snowy day. Last week, we talked about Micaiah. Micaiah was the prophet who stuck his finger in King Ahab's face and said, "You are the one who has sinned, and God is going to make you pay for it." 3 years passed. Micaiah went to prison. As far as we know, he died in prison. But his prophecy rang true. He stood up for God. And now today, we're going to talk about a couple of women that probably you've never heard of. Puah and Shiphrah. Puah and Shiphrah. Now, if you don't have a clue about who they are, that's great, because that means I know you're going to learn something today. You'll leave knowing at least one thing. Some of you will also leave knowing two things: how Tarzan sounds. But we meet Puah and Shiphrah in the first chapter of Exodus. But their story really begins with the story of Joseph, the boy who had the coat of many colors. You'll remember that Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt by his own brothers. But because he honored God and believed in God and always did the right thing, God took care of him and just kept promoting him, promoted him to prime minister of the entire country, so that Joseph could eventually bring his father Jacob and all of his brothers and their families to Egypt and avoid the horrible famine that was taking place in Israel. Over several generations, the Israelites stayed in Egypt and were fruitful and multiplied, and they were an underclass that was very successful, is the way you may say it. Chapter 1, verse 8 begins, though, eventually a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to his people, "Look, the people of Israel now outnumber us, and are stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us. Then they will escape from the country." So what plan is the wicked king going to come up with? He devised a plan, believe it or not, to commit genocide against the Jews. We pick up in verse 15. So Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave this order to the Hebrew midwives: "Here are our gold medal winners, Shiphrah and Puah. When you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If the baby is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live." But because the midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king's orders. They allowed the boys to live too. Hey, don't just fly through that verse, okay? But because the midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king's orders and allowed the boy to live too. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives. "Why have you done this?" he demanded. "Why have you allowed the boys to live?" "Well, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women," the midwives replied. "They are more vigorous and have babies so quickly that we cannot get there in time." So God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile River, but you may let the girls live." Puah and Shiphrah were, you might say, the OBGYN doctors of their day. They were trained to deliver babies. For all of their medical careers, their focus had been on delivering healthy Jewish babies, so they were heartbroken when the king commanded them to kill all the male babies. Well, who wouldn't be? And so Hebrew midwives sat on a stool below the eye level of the birth mother with a sharp knife to cut the umbilical cord, and it would have been such a simple task to use that knife to then kill the baby and tell the parents there had been a fatal complication at birth. And that's what the Pharaoh had told them to do. If Puah and Shiphrah refused to obey the king, they could have been executed themselves. I don't know how they discussed it among each other, or whether they discussed it among each other or not. But in my imagination, I see them going straight from the palace to a little Hebrew home where an expectant mother's water had just broken, and Puah and Shiphrah sprang into action like the professionals they were, and after a while a tiny little cry is heard, and Puah notices it's a boy, and Shiphrah has the knife in her hand and is ready to do the act, but with a quick nod of agreement, instead of taking it to the baby, she cuts the cord and ties off both ends. And in that moment of choice, and every one of us at some time or another comes to a moment of choice. These two champions for God made a brave choice. They chose life, and they wrap up the infant and place him in his mother's arms. And Shiphrah says, "Congratulations, Hannah. It's a healthy baby boy. May God be praised." Now you know why Puah and Shiphrah are champions. They were ordered by the highest authority in the land to kill the baby boys, and instead they let them live at the risk of their own lives. A couple of quick, important life lessons I want us to learn from these gold medalists for God. Twice in our short passage, we read that Puah and Shiphrah feared God. They broke Pharaoh's law in order to obey the law of God. And we have a name for that in our country even now. We call that civil disobedience. Since they broke the law, you may be, and I'm calling them a champion, you may be wondering, is it okay for you to break the law? Listen carefully. A Christian may choose to commit civil disobedience. I'll give you a couple examples of it in a minute. Only when the law of the land commands you to do something God's law prohibits, or when man's law forbids you to do something that God's law commands. And even then, you have to be willing to suffer the consequences of your choice. I can promise you that driving 65 miles an hour in a 30 mile per hour zone doesn't qualify for civil disobedience. But sometimes when man's law contradicts God's law, we are faced with a choice. That happened on an afternoon in Montgomery, Alabama in 1956, when a young, hard-working woman named Rosa Parks got on a bus, a city bus in Montgomery, and the white man sitting around her said, "You need to move to the back of the bus," which was the law, or if not law, custom. And somebody with guts and courage, a believer as she was, said, "Enough. Enough." And she said, "I'm not moving to the back of the bus." It precipitated 9 years of what was known as the Civil Rights Movement, because Rosa Parks decided in that moment that the God she knew was no respecter of persons, so she committed civil disobedience. And she was arrested, and because of her and others, there were so many changes in civil rights. Taking up her case was a very young black preacher down the street from where the incident happened. His name was Dr. Martin Luther King. And he became the leader of that civil rights movement. And he was not only assassinated and murdered, he was put in jail more than 24 times, suffering the consequences of civil disobedience in order to bring out what was right. That's what Puah and Shiphrah did too. Fortunately, in America, we aren't often forced to choose between God's law or man's law. But I can tell you right now, there are millions of Christians around the world right now who aren't allowed to worship openly. So they have to gather in underground churches for fear of being arrested. And as they gather, when they took their communion this morning, they were taking their communion, Jake, with their lives literally on the line. If they were found out, they could be imprisoned, beaten, or worse. God forbid, but if our nation ever passed a law that prohibited us from gathering to worship, then there are many of us who would break that law. Some of us, in essence, did during the COVID disaster. Some people predict that under the guise of hate crime legislation, we may soon have laws regulating what I can say and can't say about certain kinds of conduct from this pulpit. I doubt it will happen, at least in my lifetime, but if it does, I'm going on record right now in front of hundreds of people here and hundreds more on our telecast and saying, you can lock me up, because I am going to preach the truth found in God's Word. I am not going to preach that there are multiple genders when there are not only according to Scripture, but according to the science we are all supposed to follow. I am not going to preach that just anybody can get married when we're not, when the Bible defines, and society for over 4,000 years has defined that marriage is between a man and a woman. I'm not going to defy that. Why did Puah and Shiphrah fear God instead of Pharaoh? The worst thing Pharaoh could have done was kill them. Well, that's not as bad as the worst thing God can do to you. Remember what Jesus said? Dear friends, don't be afraid of those who want to kill your body. They cannot do any more to you after that. That's all they can do. And all the great Christian martyrs of history know that's true as they celebrate with the Lord in heaven right now. But I'll tell you whom to fear. Fear God, who has the power to kill you and then throw you into hell. Yes, He's the one to fear. What is the price of 5 sparrows? 2 copper coins? Yet God does not forget a single one of them, and the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are more valuable to God than a whole flock of sparrows. Do you fear God more than people? The Bible says the fear of the Lord is the foundation of true knowledge. But fools despise wisdom and discipline. Fear of God doesn't mean you cringe in terror before Him. It means you love Him with a passionate affection. Here's something else. Puah and Shiphrah were forced to choose between the life and death of those infants. I can't even imagine being in that position. They were forced to choose between the life and the death of those newborn babies. And they chose life. Now, some critics say they lied to Pharaoh by saying the Hebrew women were having babies before they could arrive and kill them. Lying is never right, they would say. But in the case of choosing life and death, life is always the right choice. Puah and Shiphrah were doing what those brave European Christians did during World War II when they were illegally hiding Jews from the Nazis. It was a life and death choice, and they chose life. I can't read this story without thinking about the death of preborn children in our day and time since 1973 and the passing of Roe v. Wade. The major difference between then and now is that we have the technology to kill a baby in the womb. And I'm certain that if Pharaoh had been in possession of that technology, he'd have done it, and he would not have needed Puah and Shiphrah at all. But since 1973, our nation is corporately guilty of snuffing out the beating hearts of millions of children who never had a chance to live. Amen. We know from Jeremiah 1:5 that God forms us in the womb and already knows us then and has chosen us for various tasks then. We know from our great Declaration of Independence that it says we hold these truths to be self-evident. I want you to notice two things. That's the first thing. They're self-evident. That all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator. That's the second thing. These self-evident truths are given to us by our Creator, not by our ever-changing politicians. Whether it be the executive branch, the judicial branch, or the legislative branch. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The very first unalienable right is the right to life. If you do not have the right to live, even as a baby, certainly up to full term. If you do not have the right to live, what does it matter about liberty and pursuit of happiness? You don't have that either. Puah and Shiphrah understood well before the Declaration of Independence that this is part of God's will. So there's no question in my mind that God is pro-life. But when you think about it, God is always pro-choice in the sense that He has always given us a choice about everything in life. We aren't robots who are programmed to make predetermined choices. He's also pro-choice in that He gave Puah and Shiphrah the right to make the decision about what they were going to do. And they made the right one. Every day you have choices. I'm going to talk about that in the adult class tonight in Vacation Bible School. I'm going to talk about winning at decisions. Winning at decisions, winning at choices. Every day you have choices. Some lead to life, some lead to death. But when you choose Jesus, you have chosen life, and not just life here, but life for all eternity, because Jesus was the one who said, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. There's a law of cause and effect woven into the fabric of our universe. It basically says the small choices you make now can have enormous consequences down the road. In hindsight, the bravery of Puah and Shiphrah to not kill the boy babies saved an entire generation of Hebrew men. And included in that generation was a man named Moses. God's deliverer. If Puah and Shiphrah hadn't displayed the bravery to defy Pharaoh's order, Moses' mother would have never had the opportunity to place him in a basket in the river to be discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. Just think, everything that would have been different in world history if Pharaoh had succeeded in killing the Jews, because they were the people through whom God sent us, the Messiah of the world. throughout history, there have been many intentional attempts to destroy the Jews and the nation of Israel. Pharaoh tried and failed. In our text this morning, later you'll remember when Jesus was born, Herod the Great tried to massacre God's deliverer, had all the baby boys in Bethlehem killed, but he failed because Jesus' parents fled by the skin of their teeth to Egypt with him. Do you think it's simply a historical coincidence that Hitler had millions of Jews killed in World War II? And for 1900 years, there wasn't even a nation called Israel. The Jewish people were dispersed around the world. They were called the diaspora. And Israel came back into existence in 1948 as a nation for the first time since 70 AD. So why should we be surprised when Iran and other Muslim nations publicly announce that they are committed to the total annihilation of Israel from the river to the sea? Wake up, America. Wake up, Christians. But the point I'm making is the seemingly insignificant choices of Puah and Shiphrah had an impact on world events that those two women could never have imagined. In the same way, every little choice you make has a consequence. You make bad choices, those closest to you will experience negative consequences. You make champion choices, choose to do the right thing, and those around you will experience positive consequences. That's why it's so important for you and me to do the right thing every time we have opportunity. And then if you do that patiently, consistently, you will not have to be weary in doing good. For at the proper time, you will reap a harvest if you do not give up. And as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who belong to the family of believers. In the scientific community, there's a theory called the butterfly effect. The phrase was coined in 1960 by a meteorologist at MIT named Edward Lorenz. He was using a computer program that simulated weather patterns, and he mistakenly entered a number in by the 1,000th decimal point. He thought it wouldn't really affect a weather model, it was so small, but to his surprise, that tiny mathematical error changed the entire national weather pattern. And he said this would make it possible for a tiny puff of wind, like a butterfly flapping its wings, conceivably could alter wind currents and change the weather patterns thousands of miles away. Thus, the butterfly effect. As applied to all of life, and particularly to Christian life, the butterfly effect says small choices and small actions become magnified over time and can have major consequences. We sometimes forget to contact the dots between choices and consequences. I'm going to tell an interesting story, I think, about that tonight. That's why when you do the right thing, there are always positive results. Close by telling you, like I have the previous 2 weeks, an incredible Olympic story and how it relates to us as Christians today. The first Olympic gold medalist to be born in China and to die in China was Eric Liddell. Although he was competing for Scotland, he spent most of his life in China, and China has claimed him as their first Olympic hero. Eric Liddell was born on January 16th in 1904 in Tianjin, China, the son of Scottish missionaries. He later attended school in Scotland, where he excelled in rugby and track, and he qualified for several events, including the 100-meter dash in the 1924 Olympics in Paris. Contrary to what the award-winning and great movie Chariots of Fire says, Liddell knew months in advance that the qualifying heat for the 100-meter would be run on Sunday. Because of his personal conviction against competing on the Lord's Day, he arrived in Paris knowing he wouldn't run on Sunday. He had also been selected to run in the 4x100 and the 4x40 relay, both of which were run on Sunday as well. His decision could have cost him 3 gold medals, not just one. But obviously, Eric was interested in a different kind of gold. There was great pressure from friends and other athletes for Eric to compromise his conviction. The Prince of Wales personally begged him to reconsider and run on Sunday. But Eric politely refused the prince because of his commitment to his real king. As the starting gun sounded on that Sunday morning for the 100-meter race, Eric was in a church in Paris giving his testimony, less than 2 miles from the Olympic Stadium. He earned a spot in the finals for the 400 meters, which wasn't held on a Sunday. On the day of his race, as Little stood near the starting line, an American trainer slipped a piece of paper in his hand with a quotation from 1 Samuel 2:30. "Those who honor me, I will honor," it said. Eric exploded out of the blocks with that paper crushed in his fist as if it was a 100-meter sprint. Observers expected him to fade because he ran so hard from the very beginning, but he threw his head back and ran. And as he had commented one time, and the film showed so delicately, "When I run, I feel God's pleasure." Eric crossed the finish line, breaking the all-time world record, finishing 5 meters ahead of the second-place runner. He had won the gold medal in 47.6 seconds, and after winning the gold medal, he was a celebrity, and he could have chosen any job in the world, especially that he wanted in Scotland. Instead, he chose to return to China and continue teaching young students about Jesus Christ for the next several years. In 1943, when the Japanese occupied China, Little was then imprisoned in the Waiheisen internment camp. For the next 2 years, he worked in terrible conditions to try to improve the morale of the other prisoners and to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with them. Winston Churchill arranged a prisoner exchange with the Japanese. And because Little was a famous athlete, he was near the top of the list to be liberated. But at the last minute, Eric gave up his place to a pregnant woman so she could live and her child could live. Prisoners were given just enough food and water to barely keep them alive. And on February the 21st, 1945, malnourished and sick, our Olympic champion and our God's gold champion died. In 1991, a memorial plaque was placed at the site of Eric Little's death in Weifang. And the inscription was taken from a simple verse in Isaiah that says, "They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not be faint." Puah and Shiphrah did the right thing by choosing to be a champion for God rather than obedient to the Pharaoh. Eric Little did the right thing by not violating his conscience and by not running the Olympic race on Sunday. You and me are going to be called to make choices, to make decisions. And the temptation is going to be there from the world and from Satan to take the easy way, the convenient way, the wrong way. But like Puah and Shiphrah, and Eric. I hope, pray that we will choose the